Sagittarius. The truth's out. You're being watched, big things coming. There's a moment, Sagittarius, when the stillness in the air feels just a little too heavy. When you walk into a room and feel the unspoken tension. When a passing glance leaves behind a subtle chill. And you can't quite explain why. You've sensed it, haven't you? The feeling that something is shifting around you, that someone's attention, uninvited and unwelcome, has quietly latched onto your light. But this isn't paranoia. This is clarity. Your intuition is not exaggerating. It's awakening. Because the truth is, something powerful is unfolding in your orbit. Not to threaten you but to prepare you. A revelation is rising. And it carries the weight of long-hidden truths that were never meant to stay buried. You're not just being watched, you're being noticed by energies that cannot ignore your radiance, even if they never learn to honor it. Today's message isn't about fear. It's about remembrance. It's about coming home to your own power, especially when others hoped you'd remain small and unaware. If this resonates with you, if your spirit feels stirred, I invite you to stay. Subscribe to our sacred circle here at Zodiac Wisdom, and share this message with the soul who needs it most. There is more coming. But for now, Sagittarius, let's step together into the fire of what you've always known. Gate 1. They're not watching you with eyes but with envy. Sagittarius, you've always walked a path that others couldn't quite follow. You were never one to conform, never one to dim your fire just to make others comfortable. And because of that, you've drawn attention, not always the kind that claps when you rise, but the kind that watches quietly from the shadows, confused by your light and unsettled by your freedom. They're not watching you with affection. They're watching with envy. Not the envy that screams, but the envy that simmers. The kind that hides behind polite smiles, backhanded compliments, and conversations that feel too careful. You've felt it, haven't you? The way someone's energy changes when you enter the room. The way their tone shifts when you speak about something you love. You weren't imagining it. You were sensing what your soul already knew. There are people in your orbit who cannot bear the ease with which you live from your truth. You don't have to be boastful to make others uncomfortable. Sometimes your mere presence disrupts their illusions. And not because you try to, but because authenticity always unsettles what is false. They don't envy your success as much as they envy your spirit. Your ability to move forward after pain. Your instinct to find meaning in the midst of chaos. Your refusal to beg for belonging. You've walked through dark nights and still carried warmth in your voice. You've been hurt, yet remained hopeful. And that makes you intimidating not because you threaten but because you illuminate. And light, Sagittarius, always exposes what people try to keep hidden. You see, envy isn't always loud. Sometimes it's passive silence, the kind that doesn't celebrate your joy. Sometimes it's subtle resistance, the way someone changes the subject when you're finally opening up. Sometimes it's disinterest disguised as neutrality. And sometimes it's a pattern, one that leaves you questioning if you're too much, too deep, too expansive. But you're not too much. You're just not easily diminished. And for those who rely on control, your independence feels like chaos. But it's not chaos. It's clarity. Let me tell you a story, Sagittarius. There once was a woman who worked in a small creative studio. She didn't speak much about herself, but when she did, her words carried a sincerity that silenced the room. She wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. But she was free. And others noticed. One colleague in particular began to mimic her ideas, minimize her input in meetings, and spread rumors behind closed doors. The woman stayed silent, not because she was weak, but because she knew her truth would speak louder than retaliation ever could. Months passed, and the one who watched her with envy slowly unraveled. Their mask fell. Their need for validation became obvious, and their own insecurity began to eat away at their reputation. All while the quiet woman continued to rise, not by force but by grace. That woman, Sagittarius, was just like you. You have something that cannot be copied. A soul signature. A frequency of truth. And when people can't control it, they often attempt to undermine it. But that has nothing to do with your worth. Envy is never about the one being envied. It's always about the lack within the observer. And still it hurts, doesn't it? To be watched with suspicion when all you've offered is kindness. To be met with distance when your heart only wanted connection. To be misunderstood because your light is louder than your words. But even in that ache, you have continued to choose grace. You've forgiven not because they deserved it, but because you refused to carry the weight of resentment. You've let go, not because it didn't matter, but because you mattered more. There is a sacred power in your silence, Sagittarius. A kind of stillness that doesn't mean surrender but strength. The kind of strength that says, I see you, but I will not let your darkness dim my soul. And that kind of strength is rare. Confuses people. It makes them look inward, and not everyone is ready to face what they find there. That's why you've been watched. Not because you did something wrong, but because your presence forces a reckoning. It forces reflection. And those not ready to evolve will always mistake your light for a threat. But it isn't your job to dim down so they feel safe. It is your path to shine even brighter. Not for them, but for those who are still finding their way in the dark. If you've ever felt isolated in your journey, if you've ever sat in a room full of people and still felt unseen, know this, you are not invisible. You are simply vibrating on a frequency not everyone can access. Your energy speaks a language only the awakened can hear. And for those who can't, your existence is a mystery they can't decode. Let it be. You weren't made to fit their narrative. You were made to expand your own. An expansion, Sagittarius, always disturbs what wants to stay small. So what do you do now, knowing you're being watched in this way? You stay true. You move forward, not with vengeance but with vision. You bless them with your distance. You choose your peace over their projections. You surround yourself with those who don't just tolerate your fire, but cherish it. You remember that being envied is not a curse. It's a confirmation. Confirmation that you've stepped out of the boxes they hoped you'd stay in. That you've become something they never expected, free. And in that freedom you become untouchable. Because those who envy may try to disrupt your path, but they can never walk it. Your journey was never meant for them. It was meant for you. For the soul that sees beyond the veil. For the heart that refuses to harden. For the fire that doesn't burn to destroy, but to illuminate. Keep walking, Sagittarius. The shadows may be watching, but you were born for the light. Gate 2. The end was never loud, but it changed everything. There's a certain kind of ending, Sagittarius, that doesn't arrive with a slam or a scream. It comes quietly, like a door that gently closes behind you while no one's watching. And you walk away not because someone asked you to, but because your soul whispered, this is no longer where I belong. That kind of ending is the most powerful. It doesn't need to be declared. It only needs to be honored. And for you, it's likely this kind of ending that changed everything. Maybe it was a relationship you gave your all to, one where your laughter once lived, where your dreams once rested, where your hopes were mirrored back to you in someone else's eyes. And then slowly something shifted. The calls grew shorter. The energy turned cold. The connection that once felt divine now felt like a weight, like an echo of what used to be. And you tried to stay. Not because you were weak, but because you believed. Believed that maybe, if you just held on tighter, it would return. But Sagittarius, your soul doesn't beg. It knows when something is complete, even before your heart is ready to say goodbye. Or maybe the ending was within your career, your identity, the version of yourself you once poured everything into. You were the achiever, the seeker, the one with plans, maps, ambition carved into your bones. And then out of nowhere it stopped making sense. You woke up one day and realized you were performing a life that no longer reflected who you'd become. So you made the impossible decision to walk away. Not because you had it all figured out, but because staying felt like betrayal. These endings were sacred. Not because they were easy, but because they were honest. And honesty, especially the kind that arises from the soul, never shouts. It simply steps away. And yet, even now, there are days when you wonder, did I do the right thing? Should I have stayed longer? Should I have fought harder? But deep inside, beneath all the doubts and nostalgia, you know you would have lost yourself had you stayed. Sagittarius, your path is not meant to be paved with the approval of others. It's meant to be wild and winding, a constant unraveling of who you're not, in order to return to who you truly are. And that process often requires loss. Real loss. The kind that doesn't just take something from you, but reveals the parts of you that were never truly seen. The kind that empties your hand so you can finally grasp your own power. Let me share something with you. There was once a man in his 30s who lived a life most would envy. A stable job, a loving partner, a family that was proud. And yet, he carried a quiet grief every day, because he was an artist who had stopped creating. His life was full but hollow, and one day, while walking alone through a foggy park, he realized that the version of himself everyone loved was the version that never spoke, never disrupted, never dared to be more. So he left. The job, the relationship, the expectations. He walked into a space of uncertainty not because he wanted to suffer, but because he couldn't bear to suffocate anymore. And in that void, he returned to painting. His first canvas didn't make sense. His second was worse. But eventually, his soul remembered. And the light returned to his eyes not because the world approved but because he did. That man is no different from you, Sagittarius. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to outgrow the people who once felt like home. You are allowed to leave even when no one understands why. Because your soul understands. And that is enough. Still, I know what lingers in the shadows of endings. The guilt. The haunting silence. The moments where you see a photo, hear a song, or pass by a familiar place and feel the ache of absence. That's part of the healing. You're not being dramatic. You're not too sensitive. You're human. You are someone who loves deeply, who invests wholly, who dreams without restraint. And when something ends, it's not just the person or situation that leaves. It's the version of yourself you gave to it. That version deserves mourning. That version deserves compassion. So if you ever find yourself revisiting the ending, whether it happened years ago or just last month, let it be a sacred pause, not a punishment. Let yourself remember without judgment. Because memory is not a betrayal of progress. It's a reminder that you were there, that you felt, that you were brave enough to live fully, even when it didn't last. And here's what I want you to know, dear Sagittarius. Not all chapters are meant to stay open. Some must close so the soul can stretch, so that new alignments can find you, so that the silence left behind can finally speak. You are not defined by what you walked away from. You are defined by the courage it took to walk away in the first place. Even now, as you read this, there may be an ending gently forming on your horizon. A friendship that feels one-sided. A workplace that drains rather than inspires. A habit that no longer fits your evolution. Pay attention. The soul rarely shouts, but it always speaks. And when it does, it's never to harm. It's to free you. So trust the closing doors. Trust the moments when things fall apart quietly. Trust the discomfort that says, "You've stayed here too long." That discomfort is not your enemy. It's your compass. And you, Sagittarius, were never meant to stay still. You were meant to move, to explore, to ascend. Let the endings come. Let them close. And then bless them. Not because they were perfect, but because they brought you closer to yourself. Because the truth is, what ends is never greater than what's being made room for. And in the emptiness left behind, something luminous is already finding its way to you. Gate 3. A soul is still with you, and you've always felt it. There are some connections, Sagittarius, that defy all logic. You can't name exactly when they began, and you certainly can't explain why they still linger, especially when the world tells you to move on. But you've always known that something deeper binds you to them. This was never just about memories. It was soul recognition. You felt it in the quiet hours. In the middle of the night when sleep wouldn't come. In the soft wind brushing against your skin when no one else was around. In a song playing randomly at the exact moment your heart whispered their name. It's not your imagination. It's a thread, still pulsing between you and a soul that once walked this earth beside you. And though their body is no longer here, their presence is. You've always been a seeker, Sagittarius. A traveler not just across lands but across lifetimes. And sometimes in that vast journey, you encounter a soul so deeply entangled with yours that no distance, no death, no silence could ever untie it. You may not speak of it often. Others might not understand. But you feel it, that flicker of warmth in a cold room. That surge of emotion when you're alone and not even sure why. You've built walls not to shut it out, but to survive the intensity of it. Yet here it is again, rising. Asking to be acknowledged not as pain but as proof. Proof that love in its truest form does not vanish. Perhaps it was someone you lost long ago. Parent, a grandparent, a dear friend, or someone you never truly got to know the way you wanted to. Maybe they passed suddenly or maybe they faded over time. But either way, their departure left you changed. Not broken but awakened. Because from the moment they left, something new was born in you. A deeper awareness, a strange strength, a sensitivity to the invisible. And though the world around you continued, something inside you was quietly rearranged. You were no longer just living for yourself. You were carrying them too. There's a moment many people won't speak of, but I believe you know it well. It's when you say something out loud and then instinctively glance upward. Or when you pause before a major decision and feel the need to whisper their name just to feel anchored. It's when you face something unbearable and hear a voice, not in sound but in certainty, reminding you to keep going. That voice isn't just memory, it's communion, a soul connection that transcends the rules of time and place. And yes, Sagittarius, sometimes the ache returns, the longing to see their face, to hear their laugh, to hold their hand, especially during milestones, birthdays, holidays, quiet mornings. You wonder if they would be proud, if they'd understand the path you chose, if they see the person you've become. But I want you to know they do. They've never stopped seeing you, and they've never stopped walking beside you, even when you couldn't feel them. They're in the little things, the feather on your path, the sudden scent in the air that shouldn't be there, the way a stranger says a phrase only they used to say, the dream that wakes you at dawn, so vivid it leaves you trembling. You are not imagining it. You are not making it up to soothe yourself. You are spiritually attuned to something real, something eternal. You see, Sagittarius, when a soul chooses to love deeply, it leaves an imprint far beyond the moment of goodbye. And in your case, the love was so deep, so sincere that it defied separation. Some might call it grief. Others might call it madness. But I call it presence. A sacred reminder that you are not alone. That even in your loneliest hours, you are accompanied. Let me tell you a story of a woman I once met. She had lost her father years before we crossed paths, but he came up in every conversation, not through sadness but through strength. She spoke of him not as someone gone but as someone guiding. She would say, "When I don't know what to do, I ask him. And somehow, I always feel the answer." Once she told me she had a dream where he was planting a garden. In the dream he didn't speak. He just smiled and pointed to a patch of soil. She didn't understand at the time. But months later, when her life fell apart and she stood at the edge of giving up, she remembered the dream. And in that moment she realized the garden wasn't a place. It was her soul. And the message was simple. Keep growing even when it hurts. That woman, Sagittarius, is one of many. And so are you. The soul who still walks with you may not show up the way you want, but they are there. In the choices you've made with courage, in the moments you stayed soft when you could have hardened, in the way you continue to believe in goodness even after betrayal. That's not just your strength. That's their love alive in you. And sometimes their message is not a grand revelation. Sometimes it's as gentle as a whisper. I'm still here. You are not forgotten. Keep going. If tears rise now, let them. They are not weakness. They are water for the roots of a connection that never died. If your heart feels heavy, place your hand on your chest and breathe. In, out. That rhythm, that's life. That's remembrance. That's your soul touching theirs, even if just for a second. Sagittarius, you are not haunted. You are held. And the bond you carry, the one others may not see, is a sacred thread. One that weaves through the veils of this world and the next. You were never meant to forget them. You were meant to live in a way that honors the love that never left. Gate 4. You are not being punished, you are being set free. There comes a time, Sagittarius, when your soul no longer tolerates what your mind has been conditioned to accept. A moment so quiet and yet so profound, it shatters every illusion you've built to feel safe. You begin to realize that the pain wasn't there to punish you. It was sent to awaken you. What you once saw as abandonment, betrayal, or failure was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to remove everything that no longer matched the light you were born to carry. And although you may have begged the universe for a sign, for relief, for mercy during your darkest hours, what you were given instead was the slow unfolding of your own power. You didn't deserve the silence that met your vulnerability. You didn't deserve the manipulation that wore the mask of love. You didn't deserve to be questioned, diminished, or treated like your worth was something to be negotiated. But here you are, still breathing, still rising, still choosing not to close your heart, even when it trembled under the weight of betrayal. Sagittarius, this is not the aftermath of punishment. This is the architecture of liberation. For too long you have mistaken endurance for peace. You thought that holding things together meant you were strong. And you were. But strength doesn't always look like staying. Sometimes it looks like letting go, walking away, and grieving the version of yourself that tolerated too much. You're starting to see that the people who once had power over your emotions no longer hold the same control. That the version of you who kept quiet to keep the peace has been laid to rest. And not with bitterness, but with reverence. Because that version helped you survive. But now you are not here to survive. You are here to expand. The truth is, Sagittarius, this season of your life is about unlearning the lies you were told about your worth. It's about questioning the stories that were written for you without your consent. It's about stepping out of the role of the forgiver, who bends endlessly, and into the role of the sovereign who stands. There's a part of you, ancient and wise, that has always known how to get here. That's why even during your lowest moments, you somehow felt a flicker of knowing that this wasn't the end, that something sacred was being formed in the fire. Have you noticed it lately? The way your body refuses to fake it anymore. The way your intuition sounds louder than ever, even when your mind tries to silence it. The way certain spaces feel unbearable, not because they're dangerous but because they're dishonest. That is your soul evolving. That is your spirit detoxing from years of emotional debt. And it can be disorienting. You might feel exhausted, tender, even isolated. Because transformation is not glamorous. It's a shedding. And Sagittarius, you are shedding the skin of who you were told to be, in order to return to who you've always been. There is nothing wrong with you. You are not broken. You are simply between versions. And in this in-between space, you're learning to breathe without shrinking, to speak without apologizing, to rest without guilt. That is not regression. That is healing. You no longer need to explain why you're not the same. Growth doesn't always make sense to those still clinging to comfort. You have stepped beyond the need to be understood, because deep down you understand yourself. And that understanding is enough. Let me tell you a story, Sagittarius. There was a man who was rejected by his family for following a spiritual path that defied tradition. For years he tried to fit back in, to prove his worth, to earn the love that should have never been conditional. But every time he tried to bend, he broke. Until one day, after years of self-doubt and shame, he stopped trying. He let the illusion fall. And in that falling he rose. Not with anger but with clarity. His family didn't change. But he did. And because of that, they could no longer define him. That man went on to teach others that liberation doesn't always come with applause. It often comes in silence, in solitude, in moments of painful honesty. You Sagittarius are walking the same path. The ones who hurt you may never apologize. The ones who dismissed your pain may never understand it. But healing was never about them. It was about reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to dim. You have nothing to prove. Your wholeness was never up for debate. And if your voice trembles as you begin to speak your truth, let it tremble. Courage doesn't mean confidence. It means choosing authenticity even when your hands shake. So what now, you ask? You keep walking. You follow the path your heart has been pointing toward. Even if no one else sees it. You let the past stay in the past, not because it didn't matter but because it taught you enough. You no longer carry the weight of their expectations. You no longer internalize the projections of those who never saw your essence. You return to yourself. And from that place, everything begins to realign. This is the sacred reckoning, Sagittarius. The turning point. The quiet but powerful moment when you stop chasing closure and start creating peace. When you stop asking why and start asking what now. When you stop performing and start embodying. The old version of you wasn't a mistake, but the new version is a choice. And it's time to choose. You may still have days when you grieve. Days when the ache returns like an old companion. That's okay. Healing isn't linear. But don't confuse pain with punishment. Pain is a messenger, a portal, a key. And you, my dear, are ready to walk through the door. You don't need validation. You don't need applause. You just need to know this: what tried to break you has already lost. Because you're still here, still rising, still choosing love. And that, Sagittarius, is the truest form of freedom. Conclusion: you're not just surviving, you're returning to your true self. Sagittarius, you've traveled a long and sacred road through the landscapes of envy, endings, soul connections, and spiritual liberation. Along the way, you've faced truths that others tried to bury. You've stood still in the face of invisible eyes, feeling their weight and yet choosing not to collapse beneath it. You've walked away from chapters that once defined you, not out of defeat, but because your soul whispered, "It's time." You felt the presence of a spirit still walking beside you, not as a memory, but as a quiet guide. And you've faced the ache of transformation with open hands, even when your heart trembled. You are not who you once were. And that is a beautiful, holy thing. Because you are not just surviving anymore, you are becoming. Becoming someone who no longer hides their light to make others feel safe. Becoming someone who doesn't cling to the past for identity. Becoming someone who honors what's gone while fully welcoming what's next. You are awakening not to prove anything, but to live more truthfully. And that truth will shape every step from here. Even if the people around you don't see the full scope of your inner evolution, the universe does. Your guides do. Your ancestors do. And most importantly, your future self is already smiling, because she knows how far you've come. He knows how many times you wanted to give up but didn't. They know that you've turned wounds into wisdom, grief into gentleness, and silence into strength. There is nothing more powerful than that. So as you stand now on the edge of a new chapter, I invite you to breathe deeply. Not for the world, not for validation, but for you, for your soul, for the quiet voice within that has always known what was real. May you continue to walk with grace, may your spirit remain untamed, and may your light stay steady, even when the road is uncertain. If this message has touched something within you, if you felt seen, heard, or simply reminded of your strength, I gently invite you to like this video, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to this sacred space we're creating together here at Zodiac Wisdom. You're not walking this path alone. We're walking it with you every step of the way. And remember this, the universe is not testing you, it is trusting you, because it knows that you, Sagittarius, are not here to follow the crowd. You're here to light the way.